So hello and welcome everyone. We are just seeing people filing in, so we're going to give everyone about a minute more to get settled. But if you're just joining, welcome, and I'm looking forward to this really interesting conversation. Well, welcome everyone, and Rita, welcome from the US. How is everyone? So I'm really excited to welcome you all to this 1-hour webinar on leadership in times of sudden inflection points. Conversation with Rita McGrath, and I was actually just looking back at some photos and some events, and actually, Rita, it's been several years now that since the last real conference we had in Norway, and of course we followed your work, and we followed your work most recently with your last book. So I'm really excited to see you again. I'm very excited to welcome you to.
Pleased to be here. It's great.
So we have the pleasure of having Rita here as one of our guest speakers in the Strategy Tools speaker series. And what we've done is that we've reached out to people that we've known and we've worked with in the past in different capacities and said, can we have a conversation that is really applying your unique lens or your unique set of tools and practices, and apply that to the critical challenges that companies are facing right now. And recently we had Scott Anthony joining us from Singapore. He just got out of his own isolation. And
he was locked up in some little apartment for what, 2 weeks?
He was locked up for 14 days, for 2 weeks full.
Wow.
And I think his wife and kids were, just a few blocks down basically, but that was in a different world entirely.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to this conversation, Rita. And then also next week we have Alex, who just came out with his new book.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have Bill Fisher joining us. Then we have Rick.
Oh, great. Bill's wonderful.
Yeah, Bill, he is wonderful. And Rick is going to provide some sort of really unique insights or what we call views from the Valley. So Rick is also in shelter in place in California, and he's going to give us the lay of the land from Silicon Valley when we talk in early May. And then also we have Simon Torrance, who just came out with the book Fight Back, around how can particularly European companies and also established companies fight back with established companies in different economies. That's for a different setting. So welcome everyone. Now we do have Q&As, and especially towards the later half of the webinar, we're going to have hopefully a really good discussion. We'd like to take your questions as much as we can, and I will try, Rita, to guide the questions as they come, so we make sure that we get everyone answered as we go. My name is Chris, or Christian Rangan. I'm the founder and CEO of Strategy Tools and a number of other interesting hobbies. Very happy to have with us Rita McGrath, who I've now had the pleasure of knowing for quite some years. Rita has really done a tremendous contribution to the field of strategy in providing both some of the original work. I don't know if you see it, but we have this one.
There you go.
Highly recommended and probably quite underrated. Someone said, and Rita, you've been consistently ranked with the Thinkers 50 and others. So it's really a pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Chris.
And I know also a lot of people have been looking forward to this conversation, Rita. These are of course interesting times, and we're going to talk a little bit about the backdrop, but really focus most on applying your experience and your research to how can companies understand the situation we're in and the challenges we're in. And at least from this part of the world, in the Nordics, we've sort of seen a pattern, if you will, of how companies and how executives react over the last couple of weeks. And I'm really interested when we get started to hear your thoughts. But for the first couple of weeks, what we saw was effectively shock. Mm-hmm. Chairman, CEOs, economic development agencies, management teams. It was shock. It was denial. It was confusion. Because many of us said, this is so unexpected. Mm-hmm. And actually, back home, our next door neighbor, he runs an oil and gas technology company. And he said, this came out of blue air. It came out of clear sky. We had no idea. And all of a sudden it was lockdown. Mm-hmm. You haven't really been paying attention to the news, have you? Because, you're going to touch more on this, but there's an argument to be made that you could have seen this coming. Mm-hmm. To a certain extent. Mm-hmm. And then we have this, pretty well-documented reflex that when in trouble start cutting and cutting more than required, even for companies that have a healthy balance sheet and strong liquidity. And then really the question, and this is really a question just sort of introducing your view, is really how can companies use this situation to actually not just survive, but to thrive and transform. Mm-hmm. And if that can be a backdrop, so I'm gonna turn off the slides so we sort of see you better. But Rita, I want to just use this as a backdrop and hand it over to you, and you can start with any angle, and then we'll see where the conversation takes us.
Great. Okay. So I guess I'd open by saying, my world typically has been the world of a high ratio of assumptions you have to make relative to knowledge that you have. So I've been working in innovation, new business, sort of that world where you're sort of sculpting smoke, right? You're not really sure of what's going to happen. And for many, many years, what we've done is we've made the distinction between the more predictable, the more core, if you will, business, and the future, new, uncertain kind of businesses. And what I would observe from that situation is that, it is entirely conceivable if you're the CEO of a major corporation, it's entirely possible for you to achieve that level in your organization without ever having touched innovation, without ever having touched highly uncertain situations, because you're rewarded for being an operator, right? And you're rewarded for sort of keeping the repeatable business model going. And what's happened now is all of our businesses, the things that we used to think of as core, the things we used to think of as stable and predictable, the things we used to think of as having a lot of knowledge about what's going to happen, all of those things have now kind of come my way. So you're into my world, everybody, which I think is kind of interesting. And so here's the comforting news. We know an awful lot about how that world works, the world of high assumptions relative to knowledge, the world of uncertainty, the world of, you got to kind of create smoke. But it's a really different logic. It's a really different business model than the models that you use when you know who your customer is, what they're going to buy, what the pricing is, there's a lot of knowledge that you have relative to the uncertainty you're facing. And so I think part of, our job, Chris, and those of us working in highly uncertain strategy areas is how do we teach people that toolkit fast? Because everybody needs it now. It's not just the weirdos working in innovation that need it. It's like everybody needs it in their core business. So I'll start with a couple of basic principles, and then we can let the conversation evolve from there. So the first thing is we know in innovation, and what's happening in the startup world now is kind of bearing this out. It's a mistake to put too much funding and too much speculation on a specific outcome too early. So, a typical thing you might do in your core business is if you think it's all going to be north. So, like I look at this pencil and this is what I think the direction is going to be, and I put all my emphasis and everything on that. Well, in an uncertain environment, it could be anywhere from here to here, right? It could be a whole range of different things. So what you want is you want to be able to plant options, which are small investments you're making today, which buy you the right but not the obligation to make a future investment. You want to have lots of options so that you can kind of get the pattern as early as you possibly can. So Andy Grove said this in his famous book from the 1990s called Only the Paranoid Survive. He said, you know, in the beginning of living through an inflection point, you want lots of diversity, lots of ideas, lots of patterns, because we don't know what the future will hold yet. So principle number one is don't make a big bet. Invest in a number of different options so that you can begin to get more information and test hypotheses. Principle number two is you really want to get a hold of your portfolio. So kind of back to your cut phase of this. I mean, a lot of companies have absolutely no idea what they're actually working on. And you know, 50% of what they're working on today may not actually be relevant to the world of the future. So you really want to have a portfolio view of what you're doing. And which are some things that are more certain, which are some things that are less certain. How do we make a decision about what we want to pursue versus cut? So I think that's principle number two. And principle number three is we really want to proceed in what I call a discovery-driven manner, meaning I want to, you know, I have a hypothesis about future customers. I want to test that. Only when that test tells me a next step is warranted do I take the next step, and so forth and so forth. So you're really unfolding your plan as you're learning. So it's really a plan to learn rather than a plan to prove that you were right. And I think some of those bedrock principles are going to be super important as organizations learn what the future is going to look like.
And if you apply that to things that are unfolding right now, and Rita, I know you're speaking at a lot of virtual events, you're talking to a lot of executives. What are the things that you're hearing and seeing in terms of how companies and executives are managing this crisis they're in?
Well, I think there's you know, some of them are actually finding that they have incredibly valuable markets for capabilities that they have today. So I'll tell a quick story about, you know Ryan McManus, who I work with on the technology side of things, and he's on the board of a publicly traded firm called Nortec. And Nortec has traditionally made, you know, circuit boards and other gear for the telecom industry. And so Ryan happened to talk to somebody at an event or a party or something, and they said, well, you know what the problem is with the ventilator business, the ventilator shortage that we've got to treat people that are seriously ill with the COVID-19. The problem is not the tubes and the gear, the visible stuff that you can see. The problem is that there's a cataclysmic shortage of circuit boards. And Ryan was like, what? You know, well, we're in the circuit board business. So he called up a bunch of his other board members and he was like, did you know that the problem with ventilators is circuit boards? They're all like, we had no idea. So then they talked to the management team, and voila, within a week, Nortec is in the circuit board business. So they've reached out to their customers at General Electric and other companies doing things. And they've now experienced a massive growth in their business because of this critical supply shortage of this one component. But nobody knew it was relevant in that field. They'd always sort of been thinking of themselves as a telecom company. So I think the better companies are really finding out where their capabilities are relevant and directing their resources into those capabilities. And then we have companies that, you know, are either in sectors where there's not a lot of action, or whether they haven't figured out yet what that link to future capabilities is going to be, and they're struggling much more.
Yeah. So, you know, I can take your story, and it's a great story, and apply the strategic agility thinking by Stephen Denning, for example. Mm-hmm. So companies that maybe haven't found any new markets, and companies that would like to find some new markets, what are some steps that they may be able to take to, you know, apply a more strategic agility in the short term?
Well, I think it really begins with this whole idea of customer jobs to be done. And you and I have talked a lot about this, which is, and this was an idea that Clayton Christensen very famously pioneered. He said, you know, don't think about selling products and services. Think about your customer buying something from you, hiring something from you because they have a job they want to get done in their lives. And what's that job? And the jobs, interestingly, are very stable over time. That, you know, if I want to communicate, right? So I start with smoke signals, and then it's the telegraph, and maybe it's the Pony Express, and then, you know, on up to modern day smartphones. But the job of communicating across distance in a way that is as close to reality as possible is the same job that we've had since the dawn of humanity, but we're just using different mechanisms to address that job. So I think the first step is really think about the potential customers in your world and what are the jobs that they need to get done that you could possibly have a role in serving. So for example, in the restaurant business, which of course restaurants are closed, nobody's able to sit together in a crowded space. And a lot of restaurants are now repurposing their capabilities. So there's a Michelin-starred restaurant in New York that, you know, the owner basically can't operate the restaurant, but he worked out that there are all these critical food provision capabilities that are required for frontline service workers, that are required for hospitals, that are required for serving the homeless population. And he's essentially taken his Michelin star restaurant, kept his staff. They're now serving these sort of industrial grade kind of meals. I mean, they're not doing the fine dining, but they're using those assets to perform a different kind of service. So I think the thing to think about is what capabilities do you have? And where might those be relevant to some segment of customers that really have a need today?
If we build on that and maybe get to some of the things that we are seeing, especially in this part of the world where you have both the COVID-19 situation, and then you also have the decline in the oil price, which
boy,
a lot. You know, how can companies possibly manage this duality of both reducing cost, finding the mental capacity and the organizational capabilities to develop new solutions at the same time? So what's your thinking on that duality?
Oh, I think it's you know, it's a tough time. I mean, it's a really tough time. But history teaches us that this is also the great unfreezing, right? So a lot of our taken for granted assumptions are going to be challenged. So if I could take a minute and just talk about my recent book about seeing around corners, which is about strategic inflection points. And one of the lessons that navigating through inflection points has taught us is what an inflection point does in strategy is it takes your taken for granted assumptions about how the world works, what's true, what's not true, and what's the pattern that you're used to in life, and it sort of tosses those up in the air. It makes a 10 times shift in your taken for granted assumptions. So as an example, in traditional retail, it was all about your physical footprint. And so your metrics were all about things like inventory turns and, sales per square meter and, all those kinds of metrics. Well, what an inflection point does, and what we're living with right now, is all of those assumptions get changed as you navigate your way through the inflection point. So one of the things I think leaders have to think about is, okay, if the old metrics no longer work, if the old ways of predicting success no longer work, what are going to be some of the new ways that we need to be thinking in terms of, what's the new business model going to be? So if it used to be sales per square foot, maybe today it's sort of access to customers or something. So I think on both of those, the cost side and the revenue side, we need to be really giving some thought to what the new metrics are going to be.
And some of the companies that are struggling today, how can they engage, the board? How can they engage senior management? And how can they get, let's assume that you have a few people that are really leaning into this and say, we want to get this done. We want to find these new business models and the new ways of thinking, but maybe behind them or around them they have, let's just call it healthy resistance from established practices and maybe mindsets that are more under crisis. How can these innovators approach and engage the healthy resistance, so to speak?
I think that's kind of the classic problem of innovation, right? You've always got a few people that are really, as you said, leaning into the future, and then there are going to be those. I think there you have to look at really what's your political strategy. And what you need to think about is, how do you craft a case, an argument that allows these folks to feel more comfortable? So I don't think you want to present them with, do it my way or we're all going to die. I don't think that's very healthy. I think what you need to do is build a bridge between where they are and where you want them to be or need them to be. So typically it's starting off with, well, could we all agree on something, X, right? So if you and I were in discussion, maybe it would be, could we all agree that things like webinars or virtual interactions or whatnot may not be our future, but right now they're quite important. And if you can get people to sort of that first level of agreement, then how do you get them, to the next? So I have a wonderful colleague, Jane Prager, who teaches storytelling in our Columbia courses. And she talks about, can you get the little a, the small ask, to agree? And then gradually, step by step, you work to the big ask. So let's say you want to convince somebody to become a vegetarian, right? Well, if you've got somebody who's, a diehard hamburger lover, that's going to be a very difficult task. So you don't start with, I want you to become a vegetarian. You start with, hey, what about Meatless Monday? Could we agree that we're going to have, vegetarian lasagna on Monday instead of a burger? That's much easier for people to agree to than, having to go the whole route. So I think what you need to do is think about, what are your small asks? What can we all agree on? What are some of the things we can all get behind, rather than the huge kind of corporate demand?
Slightly different angle, but based on the shift we're seeing, and of course the explosion of online everything, how do you think that's going to impact the education sector, especially around executive education?
Oh, huge. Oh, huge. I mean, our whole program's been wiped out basically through the end of the summer. And, there's some optimistic holdouts that are thinking we might be back to business as usual by the fall, but I'm not optimistic. Until we have either a vaccine or a cure, are you going to be comfortable sitting in an airplane with lots of other people, before either of those things apply? I don't think so. So I think a couple of things for education specifically that are going to be really interesting pivot points. So the first thing I think that we need to grapple with is, content is increasingly a commodity. You can go on YouTube. If you want to learn how to do a Michael Porter 5 Forces industry analysis, there are a zillion great ways to do that, and for free, you don't. So content isn't it. I think the second big challenge is, if by the fall we can't invite students to campuses, we're going to be reduced to this online. And if you think about it, a lot of why would I pay 60,000, 70,000 US dollars, or whatever the equivalent is in euro, to sit in front of a computer screen in my living room? I mean, I would pay that money to live in the dorm, to talk philosophy, the whole coming of age experience, right? So I think we're going to have to grapple with the fact that the value educational institutions add, and I've said this for years, is not necessarily just the content. It's the thought process. It's the bringing, it's the education, right? The bringing people into a way of thinking. So I think we're going to face severe price pressure. I think a lot of the smaller schools that don't really have a great big brand name or whatever are going to be very challenged. The other thing I think that's going to be interesting, and this is a prediction that Clayton Christensen made years ago, is he said, with the advent of education becoming more of an online experience, what's going to matter is not, did you go to Yale, right? What's going to matter is, did you take the innovation course from Clayton Christensen, or whoever your guru of choice is, or Alex Osterwalder, who'll be with you next time. Did you get their certification? And so I'm going to take organizational behavior with Dave Ulrich, and I'm going to take psychology with Herminia Ibarra, and so the people that have brands are actually potentially going to be more valuable to their followers than the educational institution itself. So the fact that I work for Columbia may matter less than, you know me as Rita McGrath, and here's the stuff I do, and that specialty. So I think that's a second kind of thing that we'll see. So the first thing is content is probably not what we're going to hang our hat on. Second thing is this notion of who's got the brand, who's got the power. Third thing that I think is going to be very interesting, and this is going to be facilitated by all this virtual experience that we've got, is we're going to start to be able to credential people by what they know how to do rather than by the degree. Right. And so right now, if you get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, or God forbid, a PhD, that's a signal to other people that you've accomplished something. So if I'm a hiring manager and I say, okay, that job's going to require a bachelor's, all of a sudden my stack of applications went from here to here, because now I've got a limited number of people I need to worry about for that. But if I had some way of knowing I've got a job for, let's call it mid-level marketing and social media, if I've got a way now of independently knowing that you actually can do that job, the degree starts to matter a lot less. And so what you've then got is the great unbundling. So think of it in education, in higher education anyway, as what happened to the music industry, right? Once I can easily sell music by the song and not by the record or the CD or the whole 18 tracks that you need to buy to get the one that you really want. Once I can now sell it by the song, the whole package becomes unbundled. And now what I've got is a completely different playing field. And I think that is not an unrealistic scenario for where higher education is going to go. So a lot of the degree granting programs are going to find their fundamental assumption about what they're selling that adds value is really going to be challenged.
Rita, I think this is a really interesting part of the discussion today, and it really goes to, like you said, let's assume for a second that we're not going back to business as usual by early fall, and let's assume for a second that this is really going to be with us for some time. And you've probably seen the Harvard study that looked at 2021, 2022 in terms of social distancing. So look back to your work on seeing around corners. Mm-hmm. How can companies that are maybe getting out of that shell shock stage right now, how can they apply a better framework for seeing around corners in their own space for the next months or a couple of years? So how can companies develop that capability today?
Well, I think there's a set of practices that I would encourage them to lead through. So the first thing, as I mentioned, is you really want to do a comprehensive portfolio review. So what does that look like? That means you need to identify all the different initiatives that are underway, all the different programs and projects. And, I would put money on this, and you can share your experience too, but most senior leaders of organizations of any degree of complexity have absolutely no idea what's actually going on. So my colleague Ryan McManus and I did a study for a food ingredients company, and they had a new CEO. And all he wanted to know was, what's going on in my company that has something to do with digital transformation? So not operations, not normal business, but kind of what's going on that's sort of digital transformation. So what we did was we did a survey. And the incentive for responding to the survey was the CEO basically said, you had money for this project, Monday. Tuesday, if you don't fill out the survey, you've got no money for this project. So, if you want money for your project, you have to fill out the survey. And what we did was we sent the survey to anybody in the organization that had digital in their title. That was sort of like, and what we found, and it took us about a week. I mean, it wasn't a huge data gathering effort. It took us about a week. And what we found was 15 million euro of spending that nobody at a decision-making level, at the senior level, knew was going on. So it was this huge sort of amount of stuff that was happening. And nobody was at fault. It was a company that had grown by acquisition, and each of the acquired companies had activities going on that were sort of off the radar. Nobody really thought about them. So once we pulled it all together and said, well, let's look at what you got, they were able to start making some decisions about, well, wait a minute, these 4 projects are duplicative, or this project should really be connected with that project, and then so forth. So I think the first thing you want to do is a portfolio review, just get some visibility into what you're doing. And second thing to do is think about, well, strategically, where do you think these capabilities that you've got could be deployable in the future? What's your sort of view of what your future state could be? I think in parallel with that, you've really got to be thinking hard about your people. So who are those rare talents that you absolutely don't want to lose? Who, you know, and I'm not being Pollyanna about this. If there's no money in the bank and there's no way to get your hands on the revenue, you know, maybe cutbacks or even layoffs are going to be essential. But I think if it's handled with dignity and transparency and people understand, you know, people can be handled with a certain amount of dignity. I think the mistake is sort of sending someone an email and saying, congratulations, you're one of the people we don't want anymore. I mean, that's just very destructive. And then I think you start to think about where do we want to start placing our bets? Where do we want to start making some experiments? And, you know, research tells us that following a crash like this, and don't forget, everybody right now is writing off all the bad stuff that's not COVID related, you know, I mean, stuff that was sort of under the rug before is now all going to be sort of thrown overboard. Yeah. And so the crash is going to look a lot worse than it might necessarily have looked, because we're now dealing with all the stuff we should have been dealing with 10 years ago. And so when we come out of that, though, there's going to be a real interest in change management. There's going to be a real interest in, you know, what does this future state really look like? What's the new way that we want to do business? What's the new way we want to serve customers? Certain sectors, I expect, are going to suffer a pretty difficult transition. So I think those are some of the steps I would go through as you're thinking about how you plan around this sort of new situation.
Just a last question on that before we start taking, and we have a growing number of questions coming up here. Are there any specific companies? Are there any specific executives? Are there any specific sectors that have surprised you over the last couple of weeks in terms of doing things differently or approaching this in a more, you know, solution mindset? So any specific case you'd like to pull out?
Sure. So there was a case that I learned about in this event that you were part of as well, Kaihan's event, remember? Yep. And there was a gentleman there speaking about an entrepreneur that he knew, a small business owner, who had about 60 employees. And the business that they were in was making beautiful shutters, you know, for high-end homes. And of course, nobody's buying shutters for high-end homes. And what he learned was that the capabilities that company had were actually quite amenable to the manufacture of medical supplies, medical devices, sort of specifically, I think it was those gurneys that they used to take people who are infected from one place to another in the hospital, but do it safely so they're not at risk of endangering other patients or the staff. And overnight, basically, he transitioned his company into making those goods. And not only did he keep his own 60 people employed, he actually had to bring on about 100 people more. So he's now got something like 250 people working for this company. They're running 24/7, just producing this scarce material. Now, to me, that's astonishing. So instead of sort of saying, oh my God, demand dried up, I'm just going to, you know, crawl under my bed and drink vodka till I don't have to think about it anymore. Instead of doing that, they were like, okay, where is the opportunity? How can we move forward?
Yeah. And I think, you know, when we look back at this period of time, we're gonna find, and hopefully find some really surprising cases, just like you're describing here. Fascinating. You know, Rita, we're going to open for some questions. We have a good line of questions here. I'll try to sort through them as they come in. The first question is from Martin Kors, who's based in Zurich at the moment, and he's asking: is scenario planning still working, and how can you combine scenario planning with options thinking?
Mm-hmm. So, oh, absolutely. And this is something that, you know, I talk about a lot in terms of how you think about what you need to be prepared for in the future. So the framework from my book is basically what you do is you take, oh, I should preface that. So there's lots of flavors of scenario planning, right? And the version I'm recommending is kind of scenario planning light. So it's not spending 6 months sort of developing very, very evolved scenarios about the future. What I'm suggesting is take two uncertainties. And in the case of the current crisis, let's take, you know, a new social contract versus kind of business as it's been practiced. And then economy kind of bounces back versus economy continues in a really downward spiral. And what that gives you is 4 quite distinct future possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
And what you can then do is you can say, okay, I've got 4 futures I can conceive of. Is my strategy robust against all of those futures, or is my strategy really just locked in on one? And if I can conceive of 3 other ones, then perhaps what I need to be thinking about is then taking out strategic options, which might help me depending on which future I'm planning for. So I think the idea behind scenario planning, which is what you really want to do, is open your mind to more than one future possibility. And I think that still is incredibly relevant. And you can do it quickly. You know, I'm not a huge fan of like months-long scenario planning exercises, but I think I am a fan of things that open up your mind to different future possibilities. So if I go back to education, right? You know, imagine a future world where people aren't going to be able to gather on campus until 2021. You know, that's not inconceivable. So how are institutions of higher education who have invested in assets and buildings and classrooms and, you know, all this stuff, which if your students are, you know, sitting in their bedrooms hundreds of miles from where you are, you're going to have to reconfigure your asset base completely differently. You're going to have to figure out how to network. You're going to have to figure out how to provide all the stuff that education provides. And, you know, you're probably looking at a world where your geographic advantage as an educational institution, so Columbia in the city of New York, well, what does that mean when nobody's coming to the city of New York to attend your institution? I mean, I think those are very kind of scary, but very interesting things to be thinking about.
Yeah, I fully agree. And just a follow-up question, kind of going back to this challenge around resistance. And this was a real kind of discussion I had a couple of weeks ago. So let's say that you get, you know, your top 10 people, top 10 decision makers together, and you're supposed to facilitate a discussion around a scenario. And what you realize as the facilitator is that people are pretty much locked in and in love with their own scenario. And there's really no openness for entering into discussions around these other scenarios, possibly because they're too depressive, they're too dangerous, they're too destructive. So how can a facilitator really, you know, unlock this situation and really get people to listen, pay attention, and really join these different scenarios as opposed to falling in love with their own?
Yeah, I think what you need to do is give them some mechanism to get out of their own reality. So just as an example, one of the things I often do when I'm facilitating a change workshop of some kind is it's an exercise that was actually developed by Greg Galley and Mike Byrne of a company called Solve Next. And it's called brand takeover. And so you say, okay, for the next hour, you people no longer work for ABC Company. Your company, ABC Company, has been bought, has been taken over by QVC Company, right? So what are you doing now that you would stop doing if you were owned by this other company? What would you start doing to meet with their strategy? And what if you increased your marketing budget by $10 million, what would you do differently? Right? So what it does is it forces them into a different position in terms of their view of the problem. And just doing something like that where they're not making decisions for themselves. Oh, no. For myself, I know what I would do. But now you're in well, if I was that company, maybe I'd do something radically different. So I think some way of reframing their position in terms of what they're up to, it can be very valuable.
No, it's a good example. It's a great exercise. The next question I want to point up to is from Bruno Vaz, and the question is really, when it comes to VC and venture funding, do you think that we're going through an inflection point for the venture landscape?
Long overdue. I mean, and Chris, you know this. I've been saying this for probably 5 years now, that we completely forgot the late 90s. So we've got all these crazy companies that are unicorns. And I heard a great phrase the other day, Rishi Tabakwala was saying, you know, unicorns are going to become popcorn. That was terrific. But you know, we had all the, here's the problem. So you got vast income inequality. So at the top of the heap, you got vast income inequality. You've got basically zero return to capital, right? In standard savings, you had low interest rates now for what, 20 years, or at least 10. So this capital has no place to go. So it's been pouring into anything that looks vaguely as though it might possibly have the hope of some future return. So we have had vastly overfunded startups now for years, and it defies entrepreneurship 101. It defies common logic. And what you've got with these startups is just too much money chasing too many ideas that, you know, do we know if they'll work or not? I mean, Uber, WeWork, you go down the list. And a lot of those businesses are what they are today because they've been subsidizing both the demand side and the supply side. And here's the problem. You know, innovation and economic development are path dependent. So the decisions that were made to fund those businesses in 2013, 2015, 2018, they set the economy on a trajectory. And there was a while there where all you had to do was claim to be the Uber of, pick a sector, the Uber of books, the Uber of grocery delivery, the Uber of whatever. And you would just get all this venture capital money. And the problem with that is if you get too much money too early, you get sloppy. Really solid businesses operate with constraints. And so you have an idea, you find product market fit, and then you scale it. So in classic venture capital, when it's working properly, you have the idea, you develop product market fit, maybe with friends, family, and fools financing, right? And then the scaling part is where the venture capital kicks in, and then you have your exit, and then that's where they get paid back and you get paid back, and that's all good. So what we had was these ventures that went right from have an idea to scaling without actually finding product market fit in between. And I think that model, if it isn't dead already, it soon will be.
That's going to be an interesting landscape for a lot of regions and a lot of ecosystems. Absolutely. Kind of building on that, we have a question here. What are your views on traditional banks, and maybe traditional banks right now? You know, we saw in the financial crisis in 2008 and 9 that banks got a big bailout, and then they were business as usual. So, what are your thoughts around banks and how banks should think about growth both now and in the future?
Well, I think banking, it's an essential service, and it unfortunately, I think in the run up to the 2008 crash, and part of this whole financialization of our economy is banking used to be boring. I mean, when I was certainly in high school, the type A, super smart, innovative people did not think about going into financial services because it was kind of a boring business. And I think what we're going to find is we're going to return to some flavor of that. I think we're going to see a lot of these financial innovations, and it hasn't happened yet, but I think it will, which is we're going to start seeing a lot of the innovative risk categories. So, real commercial real estate, mortgages, all those kinds of things are going to, just as they did in 2008, they're going to be revealed to be not such great idea. And I think we're going to start seeing perhaps governments saying, look, banking has a legitimate function to play in society, but it should not be the tail wagging the dog. So there's a really interesting study I looked at which showed that once that if you think about financial transactions globally, only about 15% of all financial transactions globally actually finance the real economy. So if you think about investment, what people tend to invest in is not the new. They invest in things like real estate, they invest in other financial instruments, they invest where the return is going to be great. So I think what we're going to see is a category of traditional banks that are going to be back to what banking used to be, which was boring.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, I think there will be there are a lot of people following what's happening in the U.S. in terms of where does bailout policies and funding actually go, and what happens as a consequence. That remains to be seen. Next question I want to take, Rita, is from Mikola, who is currently under lockdown in the Ukraine.
Oh wow.
Of all places, but I hope he's well. What would be your COVID recovery recommendations to companies that are operating either in markets or industries where they are facing a double-digit decline, either in double-digit decline in GDP, which is brutal, a double-digit decline in consumption, or even a double-digit decline in profitability. So when you have this, the market is falling off a cliff, what would be some thoughts on recovery through that?
Well, in a way, this is really capitalism as usual, but just a lot faster and a lot more severe, right? So, I mean, we've always had sectors that have gone into decline and people have had to adjust. So I think it's the same prescriptions apply, just at an accelerated pace. So, you have to decide how big or how many assets you need to serve the demand, whatever that's going to be post-COVID. So if it's going to be dramatically smaller, then you need to adjust your organization accordingly. At the same time, you need to be thinking about what your next wave is going to be. So if let's say you're in tourism, well, if tourism is going to radically shrink, where are those capabilities that you've got likely to be relevant going forward? So, there's a lot of capabilities to serve tourists. So you got logistics, you got event planning, you've got emergency management, you've got, all those things. Those are relevant in healthcare. Those are relevant in other spheres, right? So I think at the same time that you're shrinking what is no longer going to be necessary to serve the market that exists, what you want to be doing is thinking about what that next wave is going to be. So, it's strategy that I've been talking about for a long time, just at a really accelerated rate. And, the new strategy playbook, which I wrote about, not in this current book, but in the previous one, which was called The End of Competitive Advantage, that may prove to be useful to some of your listeners as a way of kind of thinking about what this next set of waves is going to look like.
I'm actually glad you mentioned it. I used to have several copies of both The End of a Competitive Advantage and Seeing Around the Corner bookshelf. But one by one, my friends and clients, they've been picking them off and they borrow them and they return them.
Oh dear.
But actually, in the Strategy Tools Global Coach Program that we started today, one out of the two books that I recommended as this is really key reading is, of course, the End of Competitive Advantage. Highly recommend.
Oh, I appreciate that.
Rita, I really appreciate the monthly newsletter you do, where you kind of have an industry deep dive. And the next question that we have here is from Sweden, from Manu, and he works in the packaging industry. Mm-hmm. So his question is really if you have any special thoughts or insights on the packaging industry as we know it, and how that may be evolving.
Sure. So I actually did a newsletter on packaging a few months ago, and one of the things I think we're going to be definitely seeing in the world of packaging is a shift as much as possible to what some people call the circular economy. So an exemplar company in that area is a company called TerraCycle. They're based not too far from me in Trenton, New Jersey. And what their CEO, Tom Scasey, has been spearheading is a model where you get reusable packaging. And something that they're promoting is called the loop system. And so let's say you're Procter & Gamble and you sell shampoo. So in the loop system, so in the conventional system, the way we have it today is I go to the chemist or the pharmacy or whatever, I buy a bottle of shampoo, it's in a plastic package, I use it, and when it's done, I discard it or recycle it. With the loop system, what you do is you buy a container and it comes filled with the product. And then when the product is used, you return the container, the vendor cleans it, and then they fill it with a new product and ship it back to you. Now, why I think that's so interesting is, first of all, it takes packaging. So right now, what you can do with packaging is really constrained by the cost of a disposable package, basically. So there's there's very limited things you can do with a shampoo bottle or a bottle for detergent or whatever. But if you've got a reusable system, you can actually invest a lot more in what that package looks like, how beautiful it is, how nicely it fits into your decor or whatever, because it's going to be something that's with you for a long time. And what it does is it takes that whole waste of the packaging cycle out of the system and allows you to do something really new and kind of different. So, you know, that's one example of where I think we might be going with packaging. I mean, something that's not really been discussed amidst this whole COVID-19 thing is, I do think one of the second order effects is we're going to be looking at our environmental impacts at all kinds of levels. You know, I mean, you're seeing clean air in Los Angeles, and you're seeing, you know, the decrease in human activity is kind of Mother Nature fights back, right? You're seeing wild animals walking down city streets. I mean, it's bizarre. And I think it's going to cause us to start thinking about our relationship with the world around us in a really different way, especially if it's prolonged. If this downturn, if this lockdown is prolonged, we're going to be developing new habits. And I think packaging is going to be a big part of what those new habits are going to look like.
No, it's a good point, and I think we've seen that. Both you mentioned the Los Angeles. We have some examples from the UK with wild animals, and China, of course. One question that we have is a slightly different question here from an MBA student. So an American MBA student currently in Italy, or up until recently in Italy. Given the landscape we're in and the you know, the economic climate, for a graduate student that want to work for a highly innovative company, where would you point this student to look for, you know, which companies should I be joining, which companies should I be looking into, beyond simply reading their Innovation Theater website?
Right. Well, I'd look at the companies that are actually doing new things, you know, that are probing new areas. I'd also really give strong consideration to companies that are historically, you know, have had a good track record of innovation. So companies like Corning, or perhaps Unilever in Europe, you know, companies that have demonstrated a commitment to all their stakeholders in the past and are highly likely to continue to do that. I mean, it really depends on the person's motivation, right? What are you excited by? I mean, if what excites you is designing the perfect supply chain, well, you probably want to work for somebody like Walmart. If what excites you is probing the next generation of new materials, then maybe you want to go work for a Corning. So I think that's kind of interesting. I will say on the MBA job market specifically, I mean, traditionally we've sent MBA students, at least at Columbia, we've sent them to finance and we've sent them to consulting. And I think both of those sectors are likely to not be as attractive coming out of this as they have been historically.
No, I mean, I fully concur. You know, fortunately, we've seen a strong uprise in MBA students going into entrepreneurship, which typically isn't taught that much, but still. But no, it's a good point. Just sort of building on that, and also taking some of these questions that we have bundled together, talking about digital capacity in big companies. You know, I remember one of the events we had in Norway where you talked about the example of Gillette buying the $1 billion shave club, the $1 million shave club. And what are some of your reflections right now in terms of how companies are learning digital through this crisis?
Well, I think this crisis is going to be a big accelerant, right? Because you can't go back to business as usual. So the default option is not available to you. So you're going to have to figure it out, and you're going to have to figure it out quite quickly. So I think it's a big accelerant. I think when you think about the direct-to-consumer companies like Dollar Shave Club, they're very easy businesses to get into. But back to this whole question of entry barriers, there are no barriers to entry. So, I mean, I'll use a specific example of Casper, which is a mattress in a box company, and they were one of the very first mattress in a box companies, right? They tried to go public. And what they learned when they tried to go public is today there are 173 mattress in a box companies because it's really easy to get into that business. It's really hard to build a defensible position. And I think that's something that a lot of the new digital companies are going to be learning. So once I've demonstrated that mattress in a box is attractive, everybody else kind of looks at it and goes, oh, I could do that. And many of them even use the same manufacturers. So I think we're going to be learning that digital entities is not the be all and end all, that traditional ideas and strategy like entry barriers, like, you know, building up a defensible position, that those still matter.
We have a few minutes left here, Rita, and we're getting a lot of good comments. And actually, you have an invitation for Brazil.
Oh,
Tiago, who's based in Sao Paulo, he wants to make sure that you come down for an event or a masterclass or workshop. So as soon as you're flying, make sure that you have Brazil on the radar.
fabulous. Well, in the meantime, I can beam in there virtually,
Absolutely. Now, I have a question, and again, sort of taking several questions into one. What's your thinking around both the political economy and global supply chains and borders being open and closed? Do you have the principle of offshoring that now companies may be considering home shoring? You have more tension between nations potentially. So what's somebody thinking around that?
So I think supply chains that are built for efficiency are not necessarily built for resilience. And I think that's the first problem. So in a way, we've got a mispricing effect going on. So we know what we need to build resilient systems is all about. We know it's about redundancy. It's about being able to close down one part of a system without it ricocheting into the whole system. We know it involves slack resources that are positioned, around these systems so that you can mobilize them when you need them. And what we fundamentally had is a government, a lack of government that kind of prices the cost of these things in a way that's equitable. And you see that in lots of different parts of the world. So what you've got is capitalism kind of operating on, margins and prices and profits without the corresponding counterweight of government, which is really all about how do we protect the commons? How do we look after the common good? So I think we fundamentally got a lot of mispricing going on in terms of how we built supply chains. And I think what we are probably going to be learning as a species is, government matters and good government matters. And we really want to be in a position where we can price in the externalities of our activity in a way that, makes it fair for everybody. And I'm kind of hopeful this can be a moment where we really take a step back and say, are we effectively pricing what we need to be doing?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, many of the books just behind me here, they're all built for a lean management efficiency mindset. And just like you're saying, I think a lot of companies are now learning that you can't have optimal efficiency and also adaptable resilience.
Exactly. Yeah. And we know this about innovation, right? Innovation requires slack. I mean, if you're in a situation where you're being ground to the desk for any penny, euro, fund you want to spend, you're not going to be playful and thinking and creative. Now, I'm going to have to go because I have another meeting at the top of the hour.
Yeah. Rita, this has been very, very enlightening and interesting as always. So I will send you the questions. So if anyone has any questions, you can take a look at that at your own time. So thank you very much. All the best to yourself and the team. And
thank you. Okay, great seeing you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.